Great. Anybody have any questions left over from last class? Okay. I just wanted to say, you know, I'm not sure I presaged my comments last week, but the job of the Confederate government was almost impossible. They were in a virtually impossible position to start. You know, I can imagine how difficult it is to start off a whole other government. You saw how difficult it was and how long it took for the United States, the 13 colonies, to organize a big government that worked. To start another country, a Confederate States of America, overnight, which is what they really were trying to do, but then within a couple of months, be in the middle of a war, and being a cash poor, you know, agricultural-based economy, without a major, you know, banking system and strong currency. By comparison, I mean, it was an extremely difficult situation. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, they survived as long as they did because they managed it as well as they reasonably could. They couldn't have, I don't, you know, in retrospect, you know, it failed. I don't see how they could have done much better than they did. We're going to, and today we'll, you know, talk a little about both houses of Congress and how they interacted not only with the President Davis and the cabinet, but with the states as well. The senators, the Confederate senators and congressmen, they were from the states, and the states were not in rebellion. They were, you know, they were generally very supportive. But where there was factionalism and where defeat started to come to beat them in the face, those congressmen and senators had to deal with their own people in their states who were becoming largely negative toward the whole edifice of the federal organization of the Confederacy. So let's get started. I think is everybody, the folks at home?
I don't have anybody yet, but hopefully they'll come.
Okay, hopefully.
We're just a minute after, so.
Okay, very good.
One quick question to that point.
Yes.
The states themselves were financially and operationally pretty well established, right? Virginia, North Carolina.
Right.
So they themselves were in healthy.
Generally speaking.
They just didn't have a central government.
Correct. Or a central bank system. You know, the state, they were a lot like the yeoman farmers. Yeoman farmers were cash poor always, but they were very independent. They survived on their own without the needs, the need for big cash. And they could barter for whatever, largely, for whatever they needed. Okay. And they were the great bulk of the population. In other words, yeoman farmers were landowners, not slave owners. There were some yeoman farmers who owned one or two slaves. That was a dubious sort of situation for them because for those slave owners, they could lose their slave. They would have to sell their slave to pay for the tax, for their state tax, if they didn't have a good year. Okay, and of course, if they didn't have a good year, they would face destitution because they were feeding themselves first. That was their independence. So it was a tenuous situation for the states, but they were again, they were very low tax. I think I made the point last week, I'm not sure, but the average Confederate, the average Southerner in 1855 to 1860 were among the lowest tax Americans because there were very few large public works that the state had to tax them for. So there was no federal income tax in those times. The first federal income tax was in 1862 in the North, where the Lincoln administration imposed a federal income tax to help support the war effort, which it did. Yes.
So are you saying that the states, the Confederate states already had a militia and all they did was change uniforms?
Essentially, yeah. I
And
mean,
where did the uniforms come from in such a short period of time?
they didn't. Well, sure, yes. Each state had its militia, and as the war fever heated up in a couple of years, and especially the 6 months prior to the firing on Fort Sumter, there was more and more of a militia movement in the southern states. Now, there was always a militia in the southern states. Why? To control slave insurrections. And that was a tactic used by the large plantation owners to keep the non-slaveholders in a state of fear, always aware of the possibility of slave insurrections. Believe me, the event in Virginia, the Turner, Nat Turner's revolution in Virginia, and then that's why, of course, the John Brown raid was so frightening to so many Southerners, because here was a white man trying to get the blacks to revolt after what had happened in Virginia, and of course with the South Carolina Denmark Vesey Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolts. They were, somewhat paramount. Now, the areas, not every area of the South by any means was living in fear of slave insurrections. Certainly the people in the mountains where there were very few slaves, they could hardly care less what was going on. But in the heavy slave plantation districts of the Black Belt, where the soil allowed for the greatest cotton volume to be grown, that's where poor white folks who lived in the neighborhoods were worried greatly and participated on a regular basis in slave patrols on behalf of the plantation owner. And you would endear yourself to the big plantation guy if you were one of the leaders of slave patrols who would volunteer, watching policing their slaves at night, and this is how the society worked. Even though you weren't a slave owner, you had a role in slave control, even though slave insurrections were few and far between. It was always a mentality thing. That's just like the Fugitive Slave Act, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Very few slaves from the Deep South ever escaped to the North. Almost an impossibility. In the border South, yes, men like Frederick Douglass could get in a boat, get to Baltimore, somehow find their way, and someone like the guitar lady Harriet Tubman, she could get people, she knew the routes, and she didn't have 500 miles to go to get to, free state territory. But to those people who lived in the South, and especially to the politicians in the South, the fugitive slave law, any tinkering with the fugitive slave law, like in Massachusetts, where they had, people who were helping slaves to escape. My goodness, that was used by those people in Congress as a warning shot that if you allow these people in the northern states to help our slaves escape, we're going to secede. That's another, shot across the bow, forcing us to secession. So, yes, they milked that. But the point is that, yes, it was a difficult political situation. And, one thing led to another, and secession occurred, and the politicians basically were in the middle. They worked it to the best advantage that they possibly could. And so the Congress, we talked about the cabinet and President Davis, but the Congress was the initial Congress, again, like Davis, was not really elected by the people. They were appointed by the state legislature, which passed the secession acts originally in late 1860 and early 1861. And they went first to Montgomery, and then in 1861, because they were trying to demonstrate the importance of, the value of Virginia to Virginians, they moved the capital to Richmond as a kind of a thank you, not only to Richmond, not to Virginians, but to people in the northern, the middle states, and as a sop, so to speak, to their secession once the war had started and the Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas all seceded. One quickly right after the other, along with Virginia, to join the Confederacy. Plus, they needed to be closer to the action, which is what they did.
I find that it's interesting because I didn't realize Alabama was originally the original capital. But it seems technically it was not a smart move because it made it so close.
Well,
to the north,
right? But communications at the time was very different, and the war was going to be fought there. The war was going to be fought in largely
so they were good
Virginia.
sound technical, tactical reasons.
Right. What they hadn't really thought through was the war in the West and the war on the rivers, and that, I think I thought working on this course on the combined naval and army operations of the Union, and I had no idea of the power of the Navy in the Western theater, and I can see how the Confederate government in 1861 was focused on Washington versus, Virginia and the Army having the first real battle at Bull Run. That was on their minds. What was not on their minds was the Union power in the West, and the overnight where there was no such thing as pooped turtle, those Union gunboats, and there was no such thing. They didn't have them. They had riverboats. They had paddle wheelers and motorized riverboats. But within a few months, there were 15 to 20 Union armed gunboats, all of which were the equivalent of the U.S., the CSS Virginia, which fought the Monitor. And then there were 3 or 4 monitors soon thereafter built at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And these boats were all built on the Mississippi. James Eads was the builder of Pook's turtles. Pook was the naval architect, and Eads did the building, but he did it in St. Louis, which was barely kept in the Union at the very beginning of the war, essentially by German Americans and Irish Americans who rejected slavery and who fought to keep, at least St. Louis, or I should say Missouri, largely a Union territory. And so it's all these things that just came together that the Southern government could not really envision. There's no reason for them to see that, very early on. But it eventuated because of Union industrial power. And so that's a whole story. And next term, I'd like to do the course on the Navy, because it is a fabulous story. I'll make the commitment to do that for the next term. I would hope that you would really want to learn, because it is an unbelievable story. But let me get back to this. So essentially, the Confederate government came into power, and I'm not sure I mentioned this, but we talked a little bit about the Mr. Mention, the Secretary of the Treasury. He had a very difficult situation. Congress passed laws that would try to raise money. We talked about how the tariff was always one of the reasons why the South needed to secede. Well, one of the first things that the Confederate Congress did was to pass a small tariff at the beginning of the war. Why? Because they needed income, they needed money, and they were hoping to use some of their cotton to be able to get it out to Europe at the very beginning of the war, because there was no real there was no Union blockade. They didn't have any blockade. They were expecting the British to use their own ships, come and take the cotton, and they could make money and finance the war. Well, didn't quite work out that way. The initial blockade was weak, but it was a blockade to start off with. But in the meantime, the Confederate government had to have some money, some cash. Yes.
You mean this was a tariff on outgoing shipping?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, they
I
weren't.
think of it as being incoming, but
Well, the U.S. tariff was on incoming. Their tariff was to take away the cotton. And so the point is that they made a small amount of money. It only brought in $3.5 million over the course of the war, because they did get some cotton out. I mentioned that there was some amount. I mentioned it probably later in this class. But they were desperate for money. They needed to buy arms. They needed to equip cannon. They couldn't manufacture very much or quickly enough. Remember, I mentioned that last week, I think that 200,000 men volunteered right in early the spring of 1861 to go fight the Yankees, but they couldn't arm or equip more than 100,000. And of those 100,000, 60% came with their own arms, with their own guns, and they were allowed to enlist for 1 year. If you had to be supplied your own rifle, then you had to enlist for 3 years. So 40% about of the original Confederate Army were 3-year enlistees. But it was a struggle to survive financially right from the very beginning. And so they had what they call a cotton embargo, but it wasn't really an embargo. They were trying to force Europe, England and France essentially to support them. And because they knew that England and France, their economies, depended on southern cotton. And so in order to get the cotton, they wanted to force them to join and support the Confederacy and recognize the Confederate States of America as a legitimate government. It didn't happen that way. So the South was in a bad way because they were trying to disallow the sale of cotton, but they needed to do it anyway. I mean, it was a confused situation. A lot of the cotton, a lot of the planters decided that they were going to try and sneak their cotton out, and they did that through blockade runners originally. That's how the blockade runner thing started. But then the government took over the blockade runners, so you couldn't just sneak things out privately. The government was controlling that. Now think about this: in the Confederate States of America, where it was all about states' rights and independence, the government was now controlling what could be shipped and what couldn't be shipped. This was a bitter pill for the people who were the aristocrats of the South. And by the way, yes.
Excuse me for interrupting, but I'm trying to get a picture of who the key players are, other than Never Davis. Who are the key players at this point that are making calls?
Okay. Essentially, it's President Jefferson Davis. In this case, it was Christopher Memon, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. Those were the two men, and the original Attorney General was Judah Benjamin. Okay, and Judah Benjamin was adjudicating this, to the extent that what the law, interpreting the laws of the new Confederate government, he was interpreting them to side with the Confederate federal government as a necessity, because the government was in a position where there was a war going on, and you couldn't just accede to the desires of the 11 or 12 state governments, despite the fact that essentially the people who were the Congress, the senators and the representatives, they were virtually all planters. They were all wealthy, educated, well-to-do men whose interests were in cotton. Yes.
So the senators and representatives, were they originally the ones in Washington and then they were relocated to Richmond?
Many of them were. Okay. Many of them were.
Thank you.
And they essentially became, they came from Jefferson Davis was an example, and the Georgians, many of the men in the cabinet were, U.S. The vice president. Stevens.
Alexander Stevens.
Alexander, the vice president was a U.S. congressman for many years. As a matter of fact, in 1842, Stevens and the other freshman congressman from Illinois became very good friends. Lincoln and Lincoln and Stevens got together at the peace conference in 1865, and it was like old home week with them. And they joked around, and they were, they remained friends. And so a lot of these men. Oh. Oh, now something was missing in my life. But yes, most of those people were experienced delegates. They understood government, and that was really important because they were the government of the new government of the Confederacy, and they had the same challenges. But this time, they were the majority. In the US Congress, they were always the Southern minority, and they were doing the resisting for what the majority of Northerners wanted to do. For example, the Transcontinental Railroad. As Southerners in the Union government, they resisted the main thrust. They wanted the Transcontinental Railroad emanating from the South so that they could transport their slaves to the South. The Marlac, the 40 acres and a mule, I forgot what the act, but all of that, they resisted all those things. Now they were in control. And so now they had to forge a path in a positive way on behalf of the federal government, not the state governments. And that quickly became a rub in the Confederacy. And here you had these men who were appointed, they were, well qualified, experienced lawmakers in the federal U.S. government for years, some of them. Now they were in the Confederate States of America, House of Congress and the Senate, and right away they were being criticized by their state government and the state governors and the citizens. As a matter of fact, when they finally came to the elections of 1862, many of these leaders were not reelected by their people to be elected representatives in Congress. And among them, and I just remember, from Alabama, one of the big name, William Lowndes Yancey, who was one of the real secessionists in Alabama, and one of the most articulate, fire eaters, in the secession movement, didn't get reelected by a considerable margin in his district in Alabama because there was so much resistance to a strong federal Confederate government in Richmond. And that was in 1862. In 1863 and 1864, it became even more intensely negative toward the federal government in Richmond because it was failing. It was seen as failing, and it wasn't a success. And the great optimism and overconfidence displayed by these fire eaters that they were just going to do this and preserve slavery and everything is going to be great wasn't coming true, and they paid the political price for it. Yes.
Oh, so prior to, you said the first election was 62.
Great.
Prior to that, were these just appointed officers?
Yes, they were appointed by the state to be the first, the provisional Congress, and Jefferson Davis was the provisional president until 1862 when the elections happened. And he was elected he was elected officially in 1862 to a 6-year term, non-renewable, 6-year term. And as a result, there was friction, right away. And so a big part of the friction had to do with money and finance. One of the things that really is very significant, I don't know how I found out about it, a long time ago, but essentially they needed money. And the only real money in the South belonged to the planters. But the planters were often more cash poor because a lot of their expenses were, I'm not sure how this exactly worked, but there was a factor system in the sale of their cotton. And they had northern factors and banks fronting them the money. They wound up in the cycle, in the growth cycle of the sales cycle on an annual basis of the sale of cotton, owing money to the northern banks and factors. It was estimated, and McPherson estimates this in his book, battle cry of freedom, that the Southern planters owed somewhere between $200 million and $400 million to Northern banks and factories, businesses, at the beginning of the Civil War. And of course, as the representatives in Congress and in the Senate of the Confederacy, they were part of this. They knew all about this. And so what they thought of was a brilliant idea. Why not take these debts that our own people owe the North and just forgive them any debt to any Northerner and say, okay, you can give that to us in the form of bonds. You can buy bonds with what you owe to the North. Forget that and just buy Confederate bonds. That will help fund the initial needs of the Confederate government to, for a substantial, to substantial amounts. And so they passed this law right away. We're gonna, bring this one. Well, it brought in $12 million. This was the Treasury Secretary, Meminger, and the Congress passed the passing of the laws. Jeff Davis signed it, and it became a law, and you could forgive yourself of that money and buy bonds for the Confederate government. $12 million was received, not a lot of money. And so the only other option that Meminger had and that the Congress understood had to be done was to print money, knowing it would be inflationary, but there was virtually no other alternative. The only alternative was more money from the planter class, but they weren't doing that. Apparently the planter class decided that it was more important for them not to destroy their financial relationships with those Northern bankers for the long-term future. And they might well have felt that it was important to be able to sell cotton to the Northerners during the war or immediately after the war. Things didn't work out very well. And so they demurred on spending their money on Confederate bonds, although I'm sure some did. I don't know who did or who didn't, but we do know that how little was actually received in the original bond by the Confederate government.
So the money they were printing was based on the bonds or on gold?
No, the money that they were printing was so that they could pay for.
But they weren't just printing it like paper.
Exactly.
It wasn't based on any amount of money.
It was not based on any gold that they had in bullion, and they were just printing money so they could buy stuff. It's an old, not the first time that ever happened, but they had to do that. That was really their only alternative. And interestingly, not only did the federal government, states, banks printed their own money, states printed their own money. And that's what happened with inflation. They caused their own inflation, but they had no other real alternative. I have some information that inflation in the South rose by 60% in 1861, 100% more by the middle of 1862. By 1863, it cost $7 to buy what cost $1 in 1861. Salt, the crucial preservative, went from $2 a pound pre-war to $60 a pound by the fall of 1862. Now that's not just inflation. That's also because places like in Nashville was lost to the Confederacy in late February 1862. In right near Nashville, there were these caves with tons of salt. They were lost to the Confederacy. The there was another place in, Alabama that was lost. I think it was 1863. Fortunately for the South, there's a place called Saltville, Virginia, where there's massive amounts of salt that could be mined, and they did that. They used that to preserve food, as well as to create saltpeter for gunpowder and explosives. And so, but that still didn't. The prices went zooming, and it just was, for the $11 a month that soldiers were paid, didn't go very far. They couldn't, what was, they tried to send money home, but $11 wasn't going to do much after, the beginning of 1862. And so that's how inflation and financial issues were creating havoc, not only with the soldiers, but with their families. Now, the wealthiest class could afford what they needed to get because they were wealthy people. Poor people suffered dramatically. But it was the wealthy people who were making the laws in the Congress and in the cabinet. And that is what started to create the rich man's war, poor man's fight attitude that a lot of Southerners had. And so the tax burdens, when you talk about, well, we'll get to the business of in-kind, tax in-kind and impressment. But all these things quickly added up, and Secretary Manager forced to sell bonds and print money. The first bond issues were fairly successful. They offered high interest rates, 12% per month they offered initial sales of bonds by the government, produced $15 million and sold quickly. Congress then, in May of 1861, in August, offered $100 million in bonds at 8%, but they sold slowly. Why? Because inflation was going up higher than 8%, and it became counterproductive to buy bonds. You just didn't pay for itself. You were hurting, you were giving your money away. So the bond business became impracticable, even for people with money. And patriotism could only go so far with those folks. Interesting, the states and cities, some private businesses printed money, and they referred to them as shin plasters because they were just, you might as well. It was a desperate situation, right? By the middle to late 1862, inflation was so out of control that it became a desperate situation. This is the point where civilians couldn't afford to live on their own. Families that were living separately had to get together to try to have enough young people to farm, to create, to do the crops themselves. It was independent people who couldn't be independent anymore because the soldiers, the men were in the armies. They had young children. They couldn't run the fields. The wife, the spouse had to do everything. And so if you could possibly get a handful of 2 or 3 families together with enough young men, young boys who were too young to join the army but old enough to work in the field, you could survive that way. You could create a crop and survive. So long as your army didn't impress half of it. Yes.
So
They lost their market for cotton. They lost, they couldn't get it to Europe, they couldn't get it to the North. Do they continue to grow cotton on plantations? Stockpile it, where they do it? Well, they basically stockpile it. And as I can tell you this, in late 1864, have you ever heard of the Red River Campaign? The Red River Campaign was in 1864, and it was a joint Army-Navy Union effort to go up the Red River where they knew there were vast storage of cotton, and they were going to buy it or take it from the planters and use it, and bring it north to help the Union economy. There were stashes of when Memphis was taken in 1862. Large amounts of cotton were taken. When New Orleans fell in 1862, large amounts of cotton were taken. Large amounts of cotton were also wasted in the river before it could be taken in New Orleans and Memphis. But this was, there was cotton. They were growing cotton. The Congress put an order, but strongly suggested that planters stop growing so much cotton and start growing food crops because the army needed it and the people needed it. But there was a really bad reaction to that, including some former cabinet members like the Georgian Toombs, Robert Toombs of Georgia, blew up and wrote a very public letter, telling, you're going to have to kill me before you could tell me what I can grow on my own property. So, there was the federal government, the federal Confederate government trying to tell planters what to grow, and that really went nowhere. And so, yes, they continued to grow cotton, even though in some cases, I'm sure they started to grow more food to support the army and the population. Yes.
So the things you're talking about were really early in the war. Like,
Yes, that was the fact.
How did they manage to hang on for another 3 years? Because they lost a lot of stuff early, the money went out the window early, they lost a lot of support by the people early.
Yes. Fear. I mean, it was fear that largely got those people to support secession. Fear of abolition, fear of the Lincoln administration, and especially in places where the large, black soil districts where there were plantations and many blacks, the white people were fearful, and so they felt like they were committed to the Confederacy to save themselves from abolition. That was a very real fear among people who didn't have the political power or in their area. They needed to stay together and keep things together. That was a huge factor. Then of course there was conscription. That had a lot to do with keeping men in the army. They had to be there. I mean, you were a deserter. How bad could that? You couldn't go home if you were a deserter. I mean, they had the poor folks, I guess, where they wanted, and that's the power of the aristocracy controlling the lower classes in that society, and that's what happens when and that's the point, I guess, in all this that it was the secessionists in South Carolina who they drove the original secession of the states, the 7 states, and then they drove the start of the war because I think I mentioned that if the Davis administration didn't fire on Fort Sumter, the state of South Carolina was going to do it. And they told Davis that, and Davis knew it. That's why Davis sent Beauregard to Charleston to take command, so that he could be seen as the Confederacy. and not just the state of South Carolina. But that small state, with their core group of heavy, hard-handed secessionists, essentially drove secession and drove the start of the shooting war. So, we don't read about that too often, but, there's this great book, called Crisis of Fear by Stephen Channing that everybody should read, because it's all about how this all came down in the state of South Carolina. And it's a fascinating story. And they have, if you go down to the Battery in Charleston, I've been there, a handful of times, having lived in Atlanta for as long as I did. There are statues to Semmes and some of these other great secessionists, and then you have, the Charleston Mercury, the most influential, powerful secessionist newspaper in the whole South, driving the need to secede, driving the fear of abolition against the Lincoln administration. No matter what Lincoln said, that didn't matter. He was an abolitionist, and he was going to come and take over. The Unionists who felt like that slavery was safer under the U.S. Constitution than it would have been if in a seceded state, they couldn't deal with the emotion of the fire-eating secessionists. That's what won the day, and that's what caused South Carolina to be in a position to lead the way and to actually execute those things the way that they wanted. And much to the chagrin and I think hatred is of people like the leaders of Maryland and Virginia and Kentucky, who were not really into secession. They felt strongly that slavery would be best preserved within the Union. And they were probably right, but they didn't have the emotional power that not only they had in South Carolina, but men like William Lowndes Yancey had in Alabama. Each of those states had their fire-eating secessionists, and they were the ones who, many of whom, got put into the Confederate government right at the very outset because they were leading people. They had been in the U.S. Congress, and they were leaders, wealthy people, well-spoken, articulate, educated people. There wasn't much public education in the South prior to the Civil War, and the Unionists, just fell by the wayside one by one. And that book gives you perfect examples right from the pages of the newspapers of how it happened. So that's really an important thing. And like I said, those people were thinking about how to secede. They weren't thinking about how to run the new government. The new government just happened, and they were immediately confronted with the necessities of war, and it just was became a virtually impossible situation. What we're talking about inside the Confederate government is how did they deal with this? And the real wonder is, how did it go for 4 years? And the way I would answer that question is those people who were so fearful at the beginning were still fearful of abolition. And business of trying to hold together, and you can't desert from the army once you're in. And by 1862, conscription came in, and that's the next item on the handout: conscription. By late 1861, it became clear that the 1-year volunteers, that 60% of the initial Confederate Army from the very start of the war that went to battle and fought at Bull Run, fought at Shiloh in early 1860s. Those men were ready to go home. It's unfortunate for them that their vision, their early vision of a quick march on Washington didn't work out. And then many of them got sick. And the casualties, most of the casualties were not from the Battle of Bull Run or from Shiloh. They were from disease and camp illnesses. The camp life was miserable. They were away from home. Their families were already suffering. And they gave their commitment for 1 year and they stayed for the 1 year, but they were not staying any further than that. The Confederacy and the Confederate government, the Congress and the cabinet and the president were faced with losing 60% of their already outnumbered army. What could they do? None of those, very few of those other 100,000 who stayed home and because they couldn't be armed and equipped. In the spring of 1861, in the spring of 1862, you couldn't get them out of there. They knew better than to volunteer. And as a result, men were not coming forward. And they could see this. And they could see it coming for months. They started offering incentives for men to re-enlist. And then they started offering incentives for those men at home to enlist and come forward. And this started in November 1861, December 1861, January. Nothing was happening, nothing was working. They were forced, the government was forced to create a conscription law. It hadn't happened in this country. That was a powerful one hit on the head for the Confederate, for the Southerners' psyche. The Confederate Army's psyche was struck by that. The men from 1861 who volunteered were told that they could be on leave, they could have a month's leave, but they were in the Army for the next 3 years. They were not, their 1 year enlistment just became a 4 year enlistment. The men who were in for 3 years already, they were just there. But the men who were home, they were now enlisted for 3 years. If you enlisted, you had your option. You could serve in the army, you could serve in the artillery, you could serve in the cavalry if you had a horse and your own sidearms. But other than that, you were in. And for the men like Sam Watkins, Tennessee, the 1st Tennessee Regiment, who wrote that book, Company H. He describes the painful, it's almost painful for me to read how he felt about being a conscript after having been a volunteer and wanting to go home after service for a year. It doesn't take much to put yourself in the place of those people, and to suffer kind of along with them. The emotion of all that, the pride that they had, but now that's gone. So now they were conscripts, and they felt the fear. They understood why they were there, but they felt like they were being compelled to be there, and that the government had lied to them about the 1 year, and that the other guys weren't coming forth who were supposed to replace them after that 1 year. So that created a very quick negative reaction on the part of hundreds of thousands of average Southerners. It didn't really show up too badly immediately, But by the beginning of 1863, as the battles, kept taking their toll of men and of course sickness continued to take its toll between battles. In the winter, and then the letters from home. It was debilitating. What made it worse was the Congress of wealthy men eliminated themselves from a lot of this issue, this problem. They passed the 20 Negro law, which meant that if you owned 20 Negroes, you could have one person not to be taken off the army rolls and go home and control your plantation. Remember, it just so happened that the definition of a planter is a person who owned at least 20 slaves. So the 20 Negro law had a special meaning to the people who owned 20, and especially for the people who didn't own 20 Negroes. And so that created even more of a negative thing, because if you owned 40 slaves, you could have 2 men go home. 60, great. 20 per person. And as a result, men started looking for alternatives to service. They started doing as much as they could to evade Confederate service. They tried to get jobs in government munitions, any factory that created arms or did anything to support the war effort, but in a non-military way. They sought to do that. They sought to get doctors' letters to explain why they couldn't serve. They did a lot of things. And as time went on, those things became less effective because as 1863 rolled on into 1864, a lot of those excuses were being erased by the Confederate government. They were having to cut in more and more to these non-military jobs because they just needed the men. They started taking men away from duty guarding coastal fortifications because they needed men in the Army of Virginia, in the Army of Northern Virginia, and the Army of Tennessee. They were separated by once Vicksburg was taken in 1863. There was no more bringing men in from Texas or Arkansas or Missouri. They couldn't recruit men. As a matter of fact, even by the middle of 1862, they couldn't really draft men from Tennessee because Tennessee was largely taken by the Union and occupied. And unless you really wanted to come and volunteer for the Confederate States of America, nobody from the Confederate States of America could come and get you and drag you in and get you to fight involuntarily because it was the Union that controlled the territory after the middle of 1862. Nashville fell in February 1862. Memphis fell June 1862. Knoxville, East Tennessee, was almost always Unionist. And so here's, not only did those cities fall, but all the rail connections all fell. And so it became as you can see, not only to get men, but to transport them around. It was a very complex situation for the Confederate government, but they did the best that they could. By 1863, I don't know if you saw that movie Cold Mountain. You ever see Cold Mountain? It was about Confederate deserters who, by the thousands, made it to the mountain areas of North Carolina, Kentucky, East Tennessee, and efforts that the Confederate government was going through to capture them in there, as whether they were deserters or conscription evaders. See, not only did you have the people who deserted from the army, but they were people evading conscription. The methods that people would use to evade conscription were amazing. Some of them, the way the laws were written, you could be, if you were living in Georgia, you could evade conscription because only Georgia representatives could conscript you. If you crossed the border into Alabama, they couldn't touch you because you weren't a resident of Alabama. So a lot of times they would just cross the state line and be in another state where they couldn't be touched for whatever reason. That's states' rights. And as a result, it's amazing, many people started, one of the things druggists were, the availability of drugs, for, helping people who were ill. All of a sudden, many apothecary shops opened up in different towns. That's one way to avoid the draft. If you were a druggist, you could have, that was a way of getting out of service. Teachers, people were claimed that they were teaching different small schools. I mean, they would do almost anything to avoid service in the army. Once conscription happened. So conscription was tremendously detrimental in not only in terms of the numbers that the army could put in the field, but in terms of the morale of the soldiers and of their families. There were people who were just hardcore secessionists in 1861, who by 1863, early 1864, were just worn out and destitute and desperate to just survive from month to month. And it was, again, just the power of conscription and the fear of losing an abolition that kept things going as long as it did. On top of conscription of men came the tax and con. Yes.
At the bottom here on my page, Confederate Marylanders, that means they do something different.
Sorry about that, I didn't see that when I printed it.
Oh, well, Confederate Marylanders and Kentuckians, they weren't really in the Confederacy.
Okay.
So nobody from the Confederate government could come and conscript Marylanders or Kentuckians who didn't want to go voluntarily. Also, nobody from the Confederate, if you deserted and you were a Marylander or a Kentuckian, nobody from the Confederacy could come and get you in Maryland or Kentucky and drag you back, like they could if you were in Georgia or North Carolina. Yes.
There were 26 senators in the Confederate government. There's only 11 states, so with Kentucky and Missouri had representatives.
Missouri was one of the states that had representatives, and Kentucky also had some representation in the Confederate government.
And that continued the whole length of the war.
I think so.
Wow.
And I think as well that that it was those representatives of Tennessee, who remained supporters of Jefferson Davis, who largely kept Davis in some degree of power, because their people couldn't be effectively represented. And so they couldn't really vote in the 1864 elections for the most part, because they were under Union control. They couldn't have Confederate elections, in Tennessee where the Union was in control. The same with, once Vicksburg fell, they didn't have much of any control of events in Texas or in Arkansas. Kirby Smith, General William Kirby Smith, or Kirby Smith is what he generally went by, really had his own confederacy. He was the senior Confederate general in the Cross Mississippi, this Mississippi Confederacy. And it was like he had no supply, couldn't be supplied. He just learned of what the Confederate government passed as far as laws. But it was he had his own confederacy there. He was the general in charge, and he just ran his own confederacy from there. That's how desperate things were. And so the tax and fine was the only way for the Confederacy to tax the average person. And essentially the only way really to feed the Confederate armies. And worse yet, that once the Vicksburg campaign was underway in May and June of 1863, that's the first campaign where Grant and Sherman learned to live off the South, the Southern crops. To that point, the Union Army was fed by the Union Army. They didn't take into account the damage they could do to the South by using the South's own grain and food crops to feed themselves and take it away from the Confederate forces. So the Confederacy was doing that all along, though, because of what the Confederate Congress passed, and that is the Tax and Con and Impressment Acts. Tax and Con basically said that the Confederate government can take 10% of any farmer's crops to feed the Confederate army. And in order to accomplish this, they hired people to go and collect collectors. So there was an army of collectors. In his book, the Confederacy as a Revolutionary Experience, Emory Thomas indicated that at some point during the war, the Confederacy had 70,000 employees over and above the army who were doing the work of the Confederate government in the states. The Confederate government didn't have representatives, at the state level. There was a brand new government. So basically, they had to hire people and pay them to go and do things like collect the food. Talk about a difficult job. They were fairly well despised by average people, but they collected. That's how the Confederate Army was fed for a good part of the war. And unfortunately for some Confederate families, they happened to live near railroads or near cities that were often transversed by armies, by different units. So they got hit much more often. It was not an even deal. If you were a farmer living in an isolated area, the army, these impressment people didn't really get to you very often. If you were near a transportation hub, where the armies were moving around on a regular basis, you got hit probably much more often and more devastatingly by your own people. Governor Vance of North Carolina had a terrible, terrible relationship with several Confederate cavalry organizations that patrolled and basically took what they wanted from farmers and poor farmers in North Carolina. And those people complained bitterly to Governor Vance, as they did, state by state. Governor Brown of Georgia had a very negative relationship with the Confederate government in Richmond. I think I mentioned about Joe Brown's army. That was just one of the things that pushed some of these people who were more states' rights oriented than others, who wouldn't, give in to such federal control. But that's what was going on, and it was a desperate situation. They couldn't. The people didn't have enough money to be taxed for cash on that basis. So basically, the government had to take what they could, and their basic need was to feed the army, and that's how they did it. I mean, it was a bad situation. So that's the Confederate government, their job. One of the jobs that the Confederate government had was to try to get England and France and other nations to officially recognize the Confederate States of America in order to gain, a level of opportunity for trade. Palmerston was the prime minister of Britain at the time, and his thought was, as an Englishman, not to try and had to deal with had a good recollection of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Their interest was certainly in having two governments in America. One would basically warring or somehow against each other, which would diminish the power of the United States. And a war in this country that did anything to diminish the supply of that was so important for the British economy was really going to hurt Britain. And to that extent, the British government had great interest in supporting the Confederacy, and the Confederacy knew that. Same with France to a lesser extent. But so Palmerston, felt like if there was an opportunity to recognize the Confederacy, he would do it. What he didn't really envision was the support of the average person, the average worker, the average cotton seamstress, or whoever was working in those mills in England, to support anti-slavery. Palmerston understood from the labor market in England that he needed to be very careful what he did, because it would undermine his authority if he supported the Confederacy, which supported slavery. The average person, the average factory worker in England, was willing to give up and suffer in order for the Union side to win the war. because of the issue of slavery. And what they didn't foretell in 1861, and certainly what could be foretold by those who felt that cotton was the king, was the availability of Indian cotton from India. And England and France both started using Indian cotton during the Civil War. Apparently, it was not as high quality as American cotton growers could make, but that helped keep some of those people working some of the time. It didn't destroy the cotton industry, the cotton mills in the industrial cities of England. And so this is something that could not have been foreseen in 1861. When William Henry Hammond made this famous Cotton is King speech in the United States Senate, 1858. And so this basically kept England always seemingly a step away from making the commitment to recognize the Confederacy and welcome it into the world of independent nations. Then came the Battle of Antietam, where at a very weak point, the Union military was faced with the Confederates right on their doorstep at Manassas after the Second Battle of Manassas, August 1862. And General Lee made the decision to cross the Potomac and invade the North with the thought that a quick attack on Washington could push England and France to recognize the Confederacy. It was a good idea, but it was a bad strategic move because not only Lee didn't have sufficient manpower to accomplish such a thing, and he didn't have sufficient logistics to feed his army. As a result, when he went and crossed the river, he had so much attrition in his troops because it was also known as the Green Corn Campaign. He didn't have the logistical support of food, and the corn wasn't ready for consumption. And a lot of the army fell out to the point where by the time the Battle of Antietam was fought, we barely had 40,000 men in the original army of 60 to 65,000 that he left the Manassas area. So despite the fact that he was fighting McClellan and he gave away his plan to McClellan by mistake, McClellan still didn't, with an army of 75,000, still didn't still allowed Lee to leave the battlefield and recross the Potomac. Lee could have easily lost the war right then and there. But the fact is that he didn't lose his army, but he certainly went a long way toward losing European recognition. And that was another major nail in the coffin for the Confederate government. The Confederate government needed that, in a very bad way, and they never got it. Once Antietam was over, the door was fairly well shut on European recognition. Lincoln had his moments early with the Trent affair in 1861, and almost, created a direct conflict by boarding the British mail packet Trent to seize two Confederate ambassadors, Slidell and Mason, who were on their way to London to negotiate on behalf of the Confederate government. They were representatives of the Confederate government. And that they were intercepted and taken as prisoner and it caused an international, crisis. And Lincoln backed off and gave Trump Seidel and Mason. And that was a wise move because it kept more of a partnership between the United States and between the Lincoln administration and especially Britain. Somehow France was less powerful and followed whatever Britain did. And they were not the leaders. Britain was the stronger of the two powers, and France followed what Britain's lead. Okay. Congress and the Davis administration began blocking points. Remember when I said that a lot of the Southern congressmen, when they were U.S. congressmen, were resisting essentially the Northern legislative efforts. Once 1864 came and things were even, generally more desperate for the Southern cause, some legislators became pretty much not anti-Confederate, but anti-Davis. Davis became the focal point of criticism within the Confederate government. And that started to become a major problem because it gave Davis less and less authority and less and less of a political power to wield in relation to the states, in relation to the Congress. Men like Alexander Stephens, who I mentioned, was anti-Davis very quickly, left Richmond in the middle of 1861 and rarely ever returned, became a vocal critic of Davis, along with Governor Brown in Georgia and former Senator, Robert Toombs, the other major leader who had aspirations to become the Confederate president, and who probably had aspirations to become the Confederate president after Davis' 6-year term. These three men were thorns in Davis' side from Georgia. They didn't even happen to be in Richmond during the war. They became major critics. Senator Wigfall of Texas criticized virtually everything. He was even critical, along with Rock Bretton, the editor of the Charleston Mercury, deeply critical of Robert E. Lee after the failure of Gettysburg. They were very critical, and they had everything to do with Lee, at least from a public relations standpoint, offering his resignation after Gettysburg. But they were, very critical, and Davis came to, Lee's defense, but in a defensive posture. He was always in a defensive posture for everything that happened negatively to the Confederates. And things were adding up. They were facing one negative reaction after another. They were losing territory. Cities were falling, losing battles, key battles. And ports, they couldn't, more and more ports were being closed off to commerce. And all these people focused their criticism on Davis. And Davis's position became the GOAT, not the greatest of all time, the old-fashioned GOAT, the guy who was the GOAT of the brunt of the person who bore the brunt of the criticism. And he was, you know, at the very end of the war, he was the bad guy, the Confederates. It wasn't really his fault, but he was the leader. He bore the brunt of the criticism from the people, from the government, from virtually everyone, you know, in the Confederacy. It was only by his imprisonment and his suffering at the hands of the post-Lincoln, you know, government that kept him imprisoned at Fortress Monroe for 18 months after the war. That people felt bad enough that he was bearing the brunt that they didn't have to bear after the war. And he suffered, and that helped him. His suffering was appreciated by many, many Southerners. And by the time he wrote his history of the war, defending the Confederacy and praising everyone that he could, he became, his reputation was saved, and he wound up with this statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond after the war. But he was reviled by the war, during the war. As a matter of fact, there's a story, I read it years ago, and I can't put my finger on it anymore, and that is that when he was captured in Irwinville, Georgia, in May 1865, the colonel who was in charge of taking him back to Fortress Monroe got him to Macon to get on the train, and the people in Macon found out that Davis was in town, that he had been captured, and that he was coming through Macon. They wanted to hang him. They made an effort to get the Confederate colonel to turn him over to them so they could hang him. So that was unfortunately that did not happen. But the point here is that Governor Brown was, you know, rather than exceed the conscription law, commission those 10,000 second lieutenants. This was a situation where the Confederate national government had to act, but too many state right people were just so steadfastly against this that they fought it tooth and nail to the detriment not only of the state of Georgia and Alabama and its other states, but to the detriment of the whole Confederate cause. It had not really strong underpinnings. The whole concept had poor underpinnings, and it, the Confederacy fell because of the Union military, but it might well have survived if it had stronger national identity. It was still too much, the concept for those people of a strong federal government in the South was just not fully appreciated in 1861 and 1862 when it was desperately needed. And I think that no matter what the Confederate government did, it wasn't going to be enough to satisfy the people at the state level. And once the states became threatened militarily, that's when, they basically abandoned the Confederate government as well. Governor Brown, I'm not sure I mentioned this last week, but Governor Brown got into it became well known to General Sherman, who was in Atlanta, that Governor Brown and the state legislature were talking about seceding from the Confederacy and just defending Georgia. getting all their troops back from the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee and just defending Georgia. Now, I don't know how they would have done that. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. But Sherman offered, Sherman got wind of this and offered in writing that if Governor Brown and the Georgia legislature would secede from the Confederacy, that any further moves that they made in the state of Georgia would be fully paid for and they wouldn't take anything from the people without paying for it. He got no response from that letter, and indeed, as the Union Army began approaching Milledgeville, which was the capital of Georgia in those days, the governor and the legislature scattered, and when Sherman's men finally reached Milledgeville, there was no government there. The only thing they did find was hordes and hordes of paper money, which they burned in large bonfires. But that is a perfect example of what happened and the synergy between the Confederate government and the state governments. And basically the inability to manage the business of a government. That's really what it was. Government is a business. You have to finance it. And they couldn't finance it. And not only could they not finance it, they also needed to force men to fight. And they weren't quite ready to do that to the extent that was needed to maintain a new government, to maintain a new country. And finally, with men like Grant and Sherman and believe me, and naval officers like David Dixon Porter and Farragut and Augustus Fox and those naval people, they did brilliant work to create a navy. When the war ended, the United States had the greatest navy in the world. They did at the beginning of the Civil War. They didn't have the greatest army either, but they had a ironclad navy, and no other country had that. But it was because of the war that the United States grew, to the extent that not only, I don't know how many folks know this, but during the war, 65% of Union soldiers lived on farms. 35% lived in cities. So the Union had 65% of its troops having to leave their farms and join the army. And they did. And their families had to run the farms. The wives and sons were too young. They had to run the farm, grow the crops. But they did. Why? Because the farms, they were food crops, they were largely mechanized. They already had machines that were doing a lot of the work. And during the war, not only did these farms produce enough food and material to feed the Union armies, but Northern farmers shipped enough food to Russia to avert a catastrophe, a starvation, a famine in Russia in 1864. So not only were they able to feed their own army, they were able to ship enough food across the ocean to save Russia, thousands and hundreds of thousands of Russian people from famine. That's how strong the economy was and the power of an industrial-based economy. The South just didn't have that and couldn't compete. And essentially, that was their due. We'll summarize all this next week and bring it all together. Yes?
At the end of the American Civil War, what did the South real hope that the will of the North would fade and they would just say, enough of this? There was a struggleness in the North.
Right.
Thank
They were going to win, but the North was going to give up.
Can you repeat? Sorry. I keep thinking you're done. Michael's had a hard time hearing questions.
okay.
So then can you repeat?
Okay, the question, Michael, was did the South have a chance to just outlast the Union, exhaust the Union will to continue the war? Well, yes, they certainly had that in mind. And, Lee had in mind, doing what George Washington did, just staying with it, never give up. And, that was certainly a thought. On the other hand, 1864 came around, and the election of 1864 came around, and Lincoln won the election because Atlanta was taken, and Mobile Bay was, I forgot to mention that a month before Atlanta fell, Mobile Bay fell, and the entire coastal Gulf Coast was closed off to Confederate shipping. The Union, as a result, was largely saved because Lincoln was reelected, and had McClellan won the election, the South probably would have survived. So that strategy really had real legitimate, thought to it until Lincoln won re-election. Because if McClellan had won the election, which Lincoln felt he was going to win it in the summer of 1864, that might well have turned the tide and allowed the South to walk away from the war with slavery intact, despite what the Emancipation Proclamation said. So, I think that was a legitimate feeling. But after the re-election, and in 1864, not only did Lincoln win the re-election, but much of the Union Army re-enlisted. Much of the Union Army was scheduled to have their enlistments run out right after, by the end of 1864. And had that happened, that would have been a major setback. But because of the feeling of success in the air, because of Sherman's victory in Atlanta, because of Mobile Bay, because of the re-election of Lincoln, hundreds of thousands of seasoned Union Army troops re-enlisted. And that was essentially the death knell, because they just wanted to finish off the fight and conclude it, despite knowing that it was mostly over. But and remember, certainly not, by no means were most of those Union soldiers abolitionists. They were not really abolitionists. Many had become men who were committed to the end of slavery. One of the reasons why they were in the Army in the first place was because they didn't want to compete against slaves in the labor market, the job market. But they saw that black men were fighting, 185,000 black men fighting and giving, many giving their lives in battle, just like they were. And they appreciated that, I think, and they understood. They saw the humanity in these black former slaves. And they welcomed them and fought alongside them and understood that they had played a real role in saving the Union. And it also helped them, at least through 1877, continue the war to give them their rights, their civil rights in the South against the KKK and the Southern resistance to giving blacks any rights whatsoever. So, like I said, I think that the war itself was an impossible situation, almost impossible situation for the South. Although it's fair to say, like your question asked, could they have held out? Had Lincoln lost the election in 1864, I think that everything might have changed, and the result might have been very, very different. But it wasn't. So next week we'll finish up and talking about a lot of this and try to put a perspective, a summary perspective on the whole impact of the Confederate government, how the role that it played in dealing with leading the Confederate effort. Thank you again for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.